Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy last day of the symposium. I hope you really enjoyed everything yesterday, the site visits, the conversations, learned new things, made new friends. I would say probably the only flaw of yesterday was that the Tigers did lose. So unfortunately, they must persevere for a couple more days. Saturday, we'll see what happens. But as Alan said, let's go Mets. So I'm feeling okay with that. So just a few reminders. This is my last time to speak to all of you as a group. So I've got to get a few things out quickly before we turn it over to our phenomenal keynote speaker today. I first wanted to just mention these trees. You saw them at Michigan Central. You saw them here. And I just wanted to highlight our botanical designer that we work with, Lisa Wad. She was fantastic. And part of her goal was to ensure that she was creating a theme for our work that matches with what we all do. So, you know, we asked for rocks from our network members to highlight some of their projects. And I'm also proud to say she used potted trees so that we could donate them after. And so the trees that we used at Michigan Central and here are being donated to the Equity Alliance of Michigan's Community Center Park in Livernois, Warren area, and it's 6 blocks from the Joe Louis Greenway trailhead. So I just wanted you to know they do have a life after, so we're very excited to do that. We've gotten lots of requests about sharing contact information. What I'm going to say, and we'll send an email to say this as well, that we would like to share everyone's email information next week with each other. If you do not want your email shared, please just email us, and we'll make sure that we take it off the list. But I'll send this in writing also. But if you do not want to share your information, just let us know. We'll take you off. But I know we really want you all to continue speaking to each other after this event. What else? Usually at the symposium, we announce the location for the next one. This year is a little different. During the pandemic, we ended up coinciding with Greater and Greener, like we ended up being in the same year. And I know a lot of our nonprofit organizations sometimes have to make hard choices about picking one conference over the other, and we don't want people to have to do that. So we're going to delay ours a little bit further. So instead of in 2 years, it's going to be more like 2.5 into 27, which feels so far away. And we all know how much our landscapes can change. So probably next year we'll start soliciting ideas about where we have our next symposium. But just be on the lookout. Hold your calendar in 2027, your budgets to come to join us at the next one. But it will be at a network member location. And we welcome all ideas and suggestions. But in the meantime, there are many other opportunities for you to continue to be involved with the network, whether you are a member or you're not. We'll certainly be opening up applications for new members at some point before 27. Also, many of you hopefully have participated in our Community First Toolkit workshops, either yesterday or today. And they are, as we say, we are trying to create a systems change in how people think about the development, the operations, and the programming of park spaces. And so that's a very important part of our work. TD Bank has been an incredible sponsor for us in doing that work together. And next year, we'll be holding even more workshops, and there'll be other opportunities for you to bring in more of your staff or your teams to be doing that kind of work together. So we'll keep you updated on that. But the network's also really on the cusp of defining its next phase. So I'm going to start making early and often pitches to give your feedback in the survey. You got the first link last night. You're going to get one this night. I just want to make sure that we hear from you and what we can continue to do to continue serving you best as we move forward. As part of that, we have an interview room downstairs on the second floor. Alyssa, can you raise your hand? She's over here. If you are interested in providing a video testimonial about either what this event has meant to you, what the network means to you, we would very much welcome it from anyone. So please find Alyssa, or is Preeti, I don't see if Preeti's here, but our team can help you get set up for that. And I really appreciate it in advance for you to take that time. And last but not least, I'm going to just do a special shout out. I'm going to send links to all the vendors because it has been phenomenal working with these Detroit-based companies here. As I mentioned, the thoughtfulness of this botanical designer, but I have to give a big shout out to our event partner, Special D. They have just been phenomenal. as you've seen, everything has run so smoothly here. They have just been a joy to work with, and I just want to make sure that I mention them. And they work nationally, so if anyone else is looking to put on an event. And I'm just going to shout out the food also. Scoche for the breakfasts and lunches that we've had here, and Forte Bellinger, who had the reception food. But I'm going to send the whole list because I need you to, the KLA, our audio, and our AV people, so like they've just been a pleasure. Okay. Thank you all for being here. This is my last chance to say that to you. So I just want to say how grateful I am, as Alan said, that you take the time out of your schedules to be here and make these connections and hopefully feel re-inspired before you go back to your communities. Next up, I'm going to invite my colleague Maddie to introduce our keynote speaker. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce our closing plenary speaker for Rooted 2024, which is Dr. Elizabeth Tunstall. Dr. Tunstall is a distinguished, globally recognized design anthropologist, academic, and author who has dedicated her life's work to challenging conventional design paradigms and exploring how we can bring diversity and equity into the design of our organizations, our systems, and our public spaces. She is a groundbreaking leader in challenging how traditional design excludes and harms Indigenous cultures. And to further pursue this work, she founded her own consulting firm that helps companies and organizations decolonize and diversify their institutions and processes to create joyful, affirming spaces. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Tunstall in 2019 while filming a documentary on biodiversity and food sovereignty. So when I came to the network and knew that we would be convening this group of leaders in this space to talk about public spaces, I immediately thought of her, and I am so thrilled to welcome her to the stage. And here to facilitate a discussion with Dr. Tunstall is also our colleague and close friend, Gerard Rodriguez. Gerard's work integrates Indigenous values and traditions to reclaim land, protect water, and practice cultural stewardship in the Pacific Northwest. Just this month, Gerard organized the second annual National Indigenous Land Summit, bringing together over 200 Native leaders across the nation to work together on land access and return. The following week, 1,000 acres were returned to the Onondaga Nation in New York. And in closing, I will say that it is always our hope when you come to these convenings that you're not only reaffirmed in meeting one another and sharing experiences, but also provoked to advance the work that we do and the ways that we can continue to think differently about belonging in public spaces. And I am very confident that these two speakers will help us do that as we close out the conference. Thank you.
So first, I like to begin with the land acknowledgement. I like to acknowledge the ancestral lands of the three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wendat nations, and the land and peoples, and recognize that the land and peoples were colonized by the United States via the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. And then I pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging, who maintained stewardship over these lands and waters. I am Elizabeth Dori Tunstall, daughter of Teresa and Joseph, daughter of Raymond and Letha, granddaughter of Dolores and Johnny, granddaughter of Betty and George, great-granddaughter of Katrina and Raymond, and descendant of other ancestors known and unknown. Ashe. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, on the lands of the Catawba, Pidi, Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicora-Waccamaw nations. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, Kashkashia, and Miami nations. And I'm here to go through these slides as quickly as possible on decolonizing design, making spaces on Liberatory, Georgia, just so, because I want to have a lot of more time being in conversation and dialogue with Gerard. So I'm going to go through this just to kind of set some framework for hopefully a really robust question and answer and dialogue and engagement, but I like to set the tone. So I wrote a book called Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. And I mean, the title is self-explanatory in terms of the content. But it's this answer to this question of like, what might it mean to decolonize design? And in answer to that, I talked about putting Indigenous first, and that's what I'm going to focus on as kind of our starting point for an engagement. But there's other stuff that's really interesting around dismantling the tech bias in the European Modernist Project. Not all of us had better living through technology. Dismantling the racist bias in the European Modernist Project. Making amends through more than diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then reprioritizing existing resources to decolonize, which is the money conversation, which is very important. But like I said, for this conversation, I'm really going to talk about putting Indigenous first. Because in many of the presentations and even in the tour that I did of certain areas of Detroit, like I'm just getting a glimpse into things, but I am noticing that like having this conversation around Indigenous presence, recognition, naming, all these sort of things, like that is something that could be more strongly brought into the conversations. And so I'm here to be a little mini provocateur. And a provocation, like I'm not Indigenous. So I come to this conversation as a African-American cisgendered woman with neurodiversity about what does it mean to be in solidarity with the Indigenous struggle for self-determination. Because that's the work all of us have to do. So in the chapter on putting Indigenous first, there's kind of 4 key takeaways, and I'm giving them all to you now. Thank you. Without any work. And it's first figuring out your positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty as the land. Learn the colonial histories of the places where you are. Make mistakes, but also make amends. And then design spaces that can transmit liberatory joy to the body and community. The way I'm going to talk about this, and where is Dave, Carrie? There you are, is in the city of Toronto. I had the greatest pleasure of being in community with the Greenway. Yay, yes. And so, again, what I also love about this conference is like, it's very practical. So in the practical sense, I'm going to talk about the Greenway as a space and place that has been putting into practice these 4 key takeaways that I have presented in the book. So figuring out your positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty as the land. One of the beautiful things about, again, my relationship with the Greenway, and my relationship has been, I was on our sort of artistic advisory committee, like figuring out which of the projects are going to kind of go for each theme. For a really short time, I was on the board, but then I moved to LA, and so that wasn't going to work as well. But I wish I was on the board. So I kind of have a quasi-insider and outsider view in terms of the hard work it takes to put these principles into practice. But the first thing is figuring out your positionality, and this is where I'm going to be super helpful. So there's this wonderful essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If you haven't read it, please read it, by Dr. Zeev Tuck and Kei Wang Yang. And they talk about the triad of positionality in a settler colonial state. So the United States, Canada, Australia, many other places are settler colonial states, which means a bunch of Europeans got into a boat, came over, basically through genocidal tendencies and disease basically eradicated the indigenous populations. But since they had this quote-unquote excess land to be worked, they imported Africans to work the land because Africans had been in community with Europe for a really long time, which just meant we had their diseases already. So imported Africans to work the land, and that's where we are. So in the triad of positionality, talk about there's natives, who are the original custodians. And again, the corrective of this, like the big R, the land, is that I would say original custodians over the land, and my indigenous colleagues very lovingly said, no, we are the land, right? Again, enslaved, people who were involuntarily brought to the land as excess labor, and then people of color, which is like, does not represent all the diversities that exist within all of this group, but what it does represent is the solidarities and similarities of experiences of people who've had to leave their homelands to escape colonial violence and destruction, and coming sometimes as settlers and sometimes enslaved to places like the United States, Canada, Australia, etc. So in the essay, they talk about these do not necessarily ascribe to specific identities, but it helps me to ascribe them to identities, because I was trying to understand when I was going around in Canada why everyone kept talking about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and POC. Again, putting Indigenous first, it's IBPOC, but at the time they were talking about BIPOC. And I was trying to understand that because I understand the term POC to be inclusive of Black folks, right? Like that's the history where, again, Black women, there was a women's conference, Black women put the list of all the things that we need. The other women said, hey, we need those things too. Okay, how do we create a term of solidarity? We'll call ourselves women of color. And then being more gender inclusive, we call ourselves people of color. So I'm like, how did Black people get out of the POC group? That's the explanation of BIPOC. Okay, there's reasons there are differences in positionality. So again, Indigenous, original custodians, again, native to the land, enslaved. We forget that part, like they were enslaved as well. Again, original custodians as the land, and have had to fight assimilationist policies for over 500 years. Blacks, enslaved, involuntarily brought to the land as excess laborers. So, and this is important to say, multi-generational African Americans are not immigrants. So that narrative of immigration or building your good life just doesn't work, right? And structurally unassimilatable in order to preserve white supremacy. So the whole existence of white supremacy as a notion, which was established in 1681, was basically to separate everyone for Black folks. Because there was actually a lot of marriage, intermixture, solidarity based on class lines, wanting to desire to, like, there was the Bacon's Rebellion to overthrow the aristocratic European overlords, and then the European aristocratic overlords said, there's no way we're going to let this happen. So we're going to establish white supremacy and drive a wedge between those groups. But it means structurally unassimilatable. My name is Elizabeth Tunstall. My first language is English. Like around, I think they say like 86% of African Americans are Christian. So again, on the one hand, highly assimilated, right? But on the other hand, why we have to say Black Lives Matter is that every institution does everything in its power many times to not recognize our role within settler colonial state. And again, people of color, relationship to the land, having to escape violence in their homelands, come here for a better life. But then again, their assimilation into the state depends on a lot of things: the color of their skin, how much money they have, their class position. But the thing that is common around all of them is that they've had to make really hard and painful decisions about how much they're willing to assimilate into the settler colonial state, right? So it's like, do I provide an Anglo name for my children or give one to myself? Do we teach the language, our home language, or not? So painful decisions to be made, and that is the commonalities of the experiences. But these are distinct positionalities, and if you don't understand your positionality, then you don't understand how you can be in solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty as the land. And so I'm going to have a side conversation that you can listen to the Black folks in the room, because we are in Detroit. Decolonizing design is not 40 acres and a mule. Our reparations cannot contribute to the further oppression of Indigenous people. Because where do you think those 40 acres coming from, right? So we, particularly in a city that is majority Black, have to understand what's the relationship between Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation, right? And those two things are two sides of the same coin. So we, as Black folks, need to really understand our positionality, because we have been traditionally used as a wedge, right? So we have Buffalo Soldiers, right? So we have a convoluted and complex history. But we also, again, have to know where we stand as a people. And we can stand in one way. We can stand as part of American empire, or we can stand in solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty. And that our true liberation as a people comes from standing with Indigenous sovereignty as the land. Okay, so now I'm going to include everyone back into the conversation. So you have to learn the colonial histories of the places where you are. And again, this is a place where the Bentway does such an amazing job in doing that in terms of representing in the space through language. So this is an exhibition by Agima Makana Project, which is my former colleagues Susan Blight and Hayden King. Again, putting the language in the land, back in the land. And again, this is just one project, but almost every project, every season has some representation of language and land in the space. You can't escape the indigeneity of the place if you're interacting with the Bentway. And it's putting those histories there. And again, part of this is the land acknowledgement. This is why it is knowing, again, that first step of knowing who was there, but then going into the histories of that and the language of that in a much deeper way. But we don't want to end there. Like, my favorite movement is among the Duwamish of Seattle, so you can tell from the image. Like, they are saying, we want rent, right? Like, land acknowledgement leads to rent. And I had an interesting conversation with one of my colleagues, H. Paul. It's like, so what I don't understand is why people can pay the bank as a landlord for, if you have a 30-year mortgage, right, for 29 years and 29 days, but why it freaks everyone out to have to pay Indigenous community rent. It's not like you own the land, right? You rent the land for a really long time, right? So this is just a matter of like changing your landlord. And, you know, Indigenous principles have been like, they were better landlords, right? So I love this movement because it's saying, okay, where do we take the land acknowledgement next? Pay us rent, give us free parking, right? All these things that substantiate what does it mean to be the land as Indigenous people. So what I've learned, listen to Indigenous people and communities, and when they say what they need, show up to serve, emphasize the word serve, in the communities in their events, hire Indigenous people, especially in strategic visionary roles, seed space for Indigenous people to lead, and care enough to do my own research, right? But do ask if I don't know. And the beautiful, beautiful thing that happens when you do all of that with Indigenous communities first is the things that you learn, the structures you dismantle, will help you build amazing relationships of repair with other communities as well. But we're all human and we're all learning, so we're going to make mistakes and also make amends. And I have nothing to say about the Bentway in this particular case, but I'm sure if you talk to Dave, he could tell you all the mistakes and amends that have been part of the journey. But I just want to show off the fact that I'm on the mural in the Bentway. Two things that I do, and I'm not going to go deeply into it because we've already decided we're going to talk about this. Ways I've had to learn to put Indigenous first, not being present. And this comes from being, in some ways, African American, so that the trauma of Indigenous communities are literally, I say it's one generation step away from those of African Americans. So whenever I go to cultural competency training and they're talking about residential schools, the removal of Indigenous young from their community, like, okay, like we can go through our own family just one generation back and experience the same thing. So it's been really a lot of work, and I have a very good therapist, to be present when when engaging in the histories and present realities of Indigenous people. This one I will fail forever, I feel, because I am a captive to colonize time and task. I am the queen of the Gantt chart. And I get rewarded for that because that makes stuff happen. And that doesn't always work well when you're working with communities that have a different sense of decision making and a very different sense of time. So this one is one that I will always struggle with, but I have very loving and kind and generous community members that I work with who forgive me. And again, like I said, there's nothing to say about the Bentway, but don't I look fabulous in this exhibit? And the outcomes of doing all this is that you can design spaces that transmit liberatory joy to the body and community. So there's Dave, me, and Julia Rose Sutherland, who is now on the Artistic Advisory Committee. And this is the gala parade of so many communities coming together in joyful community with one another, learning each other's music, dance, and food, and again, feeling belonging in the space itself. And what I mean by liberatory joy is that which leads to the freedom to fearlessly say no to that which might harm you. Like, people talk about freedom, and it always feels like vague to me. But like, okay, can I say no to this thing that might harm me? That is what liberation it is, and it's very simple, right? We decide to put in a freeway. Can I say no to that? Then I am not free. And that's not just for people, that's for the environment itself, right? Joy is connection. The whole point of colonization was to keep us separate from one another so that we cannot find the joy of being in community with each other. The point of colonization was to tell us who we are so that we cannot find the joy of being connected to our authentic selves. So the goal, the design brief, is, am I creating spaces for liberatory joy? And that's my question that I ask you, is how might you do that? And I'd say for me and many others is the Bentway has become a space of liberatory joy. This is the celebration of like my day skating party in like really cold weather, but you can see that's not even all of my friends who showed up, because this is a space of liberatory joy. People felt free to be in their bodies, be on the ice, especially their butts on the ice. People felt free, again, and joyful in being with one another in this amazing space, in this amazing time. And that's what you want your spaces to feel like for everyone. So, key takeaways. Do all of this. You have an exemplar. in which to follow it, and then some things to immediately put into action. Again, I offer courses, so do check them out. Do the work. This is the work. And again, everyone comes after this like, oh, I'm so inspired. What do I do next? I am telling you what to do next, right? Do the work. This is the work. I'm helping you do the work. Read the book. Because, again, people say, what do I do next? I wrote an entire book on what you can do. And it's only $24. And I say, and then hire me to help. Because I'm more expensive than $24, I promise you. But, again, I am here to do this work, right? In community with others. So with that, we'll go back. Let me find a good slide so we can do it. Shall we be in conversation with one another? There we go. We'll leave it here. We'll leave it here.
All right. Ho Minokyo Sasamax, Sepkachatlatukani, Tualiklenesik, good morning, and thanks to each of you for being here. We're grateful that you're in this conversation with us. And Sepkecha to you, Dori. Thank you for that presentation and your work. It's inspirational and so important to see that this gets to hold a center space in all of our work and in our gathering. And I know that we've got a lot to do, a lot of change to make, and we're very grateful that you get to kind of start us off in that way. So my first question to you, we'll kind of move through this and have a little bit of a conversation. Then we also want to hear questions from you all. I've had some great conversations with specific challenges that everyone is either having or just how to get started and how to start to build those relationships, how to understand the history and the context of the place that your work is actually being built in. One of the most important ways that I've heard that put is that we need to understand the full history of who we are and what we come from in order to understand the future and where we're going. So, first question, in doing this work and in working in these spaces, colonial spaces, institutions, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of interpersonal conflict and a lot of conflict within yourself as you try to hold your values, as you try to shift and encourage people to examine some of their own. So it'd be great to hear some examples and maybe some advice of what those challenges look like as you work to, on a personal level. I also struggle to decolonize the Gantt chart. And as we work to help others, we run against things that seem so, granted. This is just the way that things are done. And those basic assumptions are the very things that we have to challenge. And in many ways, they're some of the simplest places to start. So,
well, I guess the first part is just developing humility. Like that was I wouldn't say it's like the hardest thing for me to learn, right? But it was a very pointed lesson, right? In terms of, I'd say like being African American, you're used to being the voice of social justice. And I remember one of my colleagues saying to me in the context of Canada, is like, Dori, understand, like in the US, the situation might be black and white, but here in Canada is white and red. Yeah. And so that was like, and again, I learned and adapted that. They're great humility cultivation activities, which is again making mistakes and then making amends on that mistakes. But what has surprised me coming back to the United States is like how hard it is in some ways to tell the story about, like, actually here in the United States, the situation is actually white and red as well. And so how do we, and again, I say that we as African American peoples, like how do we cultivate that humility to, in some ways, decenter ourselves as a defining story of the United States, like not defining story of the land, but defining story of like the United States, right? how do we recognize that, but also come with a sense of humility about our own positionality in relationship to, again, the indigenous struggle for sovereignty as the land. And that's again, I've toured, I've done like 38 events in the last 18 months or something.
Wow.
And that's still a really hard conversation to have here, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. I can resonate a lot with that. I mean, as a continuation of that, one of the kind of small chats that we had just yesterday focuses on understanding that relationship not only to ourselves and to each other as communities, and building that solidarity and the power that comes with that, but a conversation that we're having across all different types of people from all different walks of life. Some of those conversations kind of come within our own communities. As we work towards making these changes, we're having successes. We're on stage right now talking about something that was so radical and kind of untouchable even 10 years ago. And the real work of healing the landscape is showing as well. In my home, Klamath, Oregon, the largest dam removal project for the Klamath River just finished. And we're getting so many of these successes back. So many of these places are healing, the water's coming back to us, and we have a lot to celebrate. And with that, we have a lot of growth, we have a lot more presence, a lot more elevation in social media and in organizations. So our conversation ended up, going towards, there's kind of this tension between different generations who are still, remember and carry on very important lessons as elders, as teachers for the Black community, for the Indigenous community, of fighting really hard for everything. And younger generations who experience comfortability with being able to work in partnership with organizations like yours are coming from kind of a different place. So I'd love to hear, your thoughts and move forward from our kind of spark there.
Yeah. Well, I think the generational conversation, and again, multidimensional one, is so crucial, because like I think of myself, and I'm like, well, I guess like I'm emerging elder, because I'm like 50 something, right? So I'm not.
Nice.
I'm officially an auntie, which is so strange, because I don't imagine myself that, right? And I think about the previous, like I think of like my parents' generation, and how again, like I think those intercommunity conversations were so hard, right, to broker in some ways, because, well, again, in some ways, like Vine Deloria Jr. talked about this very well, like with the civil rights movement, like he's as a member of the Indigenous community, I'm like, why are they wanting to join in? And it wasn't, he talks about like, and it wasn't to like the Black nationalist movements that like he could understand, like, yes, you should be going that way. Why are you wanting to integrate, right? Why are you wanting to be joined with that?
Yeah.
So when I try to have a conversation, like again with the generation before me, they're because they are connected and their identity is connected to the civil rights movement, it's kind of hard to have that conversation about like, yeah, but like that, when reparations come,
Right.
40 acres in the mule is not liberation, right? That's not it. And with a younger generation, and this is, again, part of the visibility in the Indigenous community means, let's say, different communities are actually seeing what Indigenous self-representation is, right? And not filtered, but self-representation. And so all of a sudden, like, there's the potential for true, authentic cross conversations and exchange in a way that, like, when I talk to the younger generations, they're like, of course, like Indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation, that is the same thing, right? And we have to be in partnership with each other, but it's harder to have the challenges of those intergenerational conversations is the work that has to happen, I feel like, in both communities, right? All communities, right?
Absolutely. And speaking to some of that, the opportunity to have the comfortability to build these partnerships, I think, is a very different chapter. And that's something that's kind of emerging. We're having the conversation in real time right now about how to start doing that, how to address some of the challenges that come with either working with Native communities directly and Black communities sort of together and representing how we shape our spaces. And some people are kind of farther along in that. So my work has focused recently a lot more in tribal government and in the intersection of trying to build much more formal, much more colonial, systemic ties that are still very important in that self-representation piece, so that tribes are informing you on how it is that they've understood the landscape, how you need to make changes within your environment, so that these spaces, these parks, these infrastructure projects represent us not for the next 15 years, but for the next 200 years. Thinking about things in an Indigenous timeline, that's the blink of an eye when you're thinking intergenerationally. So with the time that we have left, maybe that's a good bridge to questions from you guys. I know we've had a few, Dori and I have both had a few exciting conversations. So I'll open it up there.
There's one in the back.
Buenos dias, good morning. My name is Nora Godoy Gonzalez. I am the placemaking director at the Milwaukee Harbor District. And I just want to thank both you, Elizabeth, and Gerard. No, what? Gerard, okay, thank you for the great presentation and everything you have shared. Something that really resonated with me is when y'all were talking about self-representation and what that looks like in the different work that we do. And as a placemaking director, I've really had to dive deep into what placemaking is versus the transactional, like, surface level work or the deeper rooted meaning of it within placemaking. And my question for both of you are, as we are continuing to build like infrastructure and keeping community in mind and keeping community in the center of decision making when making, these amazing river walks, parks, etc., how do we also keep, in order to not like exploit the land even further and always recognize the indigenous people. So in Milwaukee, we are on Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Oneida, and Mohican land. So that's something that I take very personal since I have loved ones who are both Oneida and Ho-Chunk. So keeping that in mind, and as we continuing to build, these amazing parks and river walk, and this is one of the last points y'all made, is how do we keep, indigenous practices in ensuring that we don't continue to exploit the land, but also continue to make these amazing green spaces, these amazing green equitable spaces for all community members.
You can go first.
Okay, sure. Thank you for that question. I think that that's foundational to a lot of the work that we do. So much of these infrastructure reuse projects focus on bringing in more infrastructure and reshaping it in a way that's positive, in a way that allows and kind of facilitates, or at least the goals, from what I've heard in the conversations in the last several days, facilitates connection between people. And that's extremely important. It's important for the healing that needs to happen in our nation and between all different types of experiences within community. One of the things that doesn't come forward quite as much is the relationship to the land, and how does the way that you shape your project, the way that space, the way you traverse it, the way you interact with it, the boundaries between a walkway and plantings facilitate your relationship to the landscape itself and build your connection to it. And one of the examples of that I've worked on in the past is bringing forward in a project that had the opportunity for it, bring forward different walkways and a different way of designing how you go from one end of a park all the way to the other, while not feeling that you are cutting through it, but you are moving with it. So that's just one example of bringing in the value in itself. To answer the question more broadly, it's really important to be in conversation with the indigenous communities, with the tribal nations, to understand what are the traditional protocols, what are the stories, the history, the understanding of that land specifically to its people, as people are the land itself. So everyone has a different relationship, everyone has a different theme, a different spirit that comes out of the way that they've been taking care of that place since time immemorial. So asking for those stories to come forward, intentionally integrating that into design, even though it's going to challenge some of the notions, the predisposed notions that you have of what a park is supposed to be, is a place to start. Then living through that in ongoing relationship with that community.
Well, and I think, like again, the Bentway, like what I love about the Bentway and the way in which it approaches, there are things there that are permanent. Although not a particular auntie in Toronto, but like other aunties, they said, like, last thing we need is a plaque. Like, no more plaque. But you do need to have things there that are permanent. But also what I appreciate is that there's also, again, rotating exhibitions and things that come in as well, which allows for continuous dialogue about what is happening on the land, what's representing the land. Also represents the diversity, because again, as you talk about, and Toronto is a meeting ground, so which we had a little side conversation about before, is like, and as a meeting ground, it's not like all the indigenous people lived in harmonious relationships with one another. So how do you account for, again, like, there isn't one history, there are multiple histories, and how do you account for the nuances of that history and the diversity of those histories? And one of the strategies is kind of being able to kind of rotate through so that people have the opportunity to tell their different perspectives of the stories. And we were talking about before, and again, navigating that can be challenging, because we talked about at OCAD University, which is the institution I was part of in Toronto, like, again, an institution committed to decolonization and bringing indigenous perspectives. And one of the conversations is like, okay, when we have a meeting, are we going to go, does the conversation go clockwise or counterclockwise? And so, again, the Haudenosaunee do it in one direction, the Anishinaabe does it in another direction. And there was a whole meeting that we thought, we're like, okay, we'll just choose a direction and go forward, right? Like, there was a whole meeting. The whole meeting was about what direction to go into. And you can hear in my voice, like, the frustration around that. That's, again, the Gantt chart thing that I had to learn. But again, that was important, because we had to hear the histories of why there were different directions, and the histories of those two relationships and communities that hadn't always, has a very complex history with one another. And yet, and so that's part of the navigation as well, right? Like, how do you account for the diversities that exist in this space? So having something permanent to recognize, having something that moves in some ways with the communities and the times and the curation of it is important as well, right?
Great. I think we got time for maybe one or two more questions. Gabby?
I'm curious on what Vaughn's question is now. Can we do a double question? It's a double question. More straightforward for me is, like, how are you thinking about decolonizing time when budget and, like, internally there are so many realities in which we have to meet all the time. So I'm like, I hear what y'all are saying, and I'm like, yes. And we got to work with all these communities, and there's going to be a change in the mayors, and all these new people are coming in. I got Q4 coming up. I'm like, so how are we thinking about decolonizing time in particular?
Well, like I said, that's my struggle. That's my struggle bus. But it's also, like, again, it's a thing where, I say, 500 years. The colonization process in the U.S. is 500 years. In reality, like, again, it's going to be another 500 years till we disentangle all this mess. I say African Americans were not free in the United States until 1968. Really? I mean, and we're still not free because we have the prison industrial complex to make sure that's not the case. So I guess my thing is that like we're one of the white supremacist cultural values is a sense of urgency, right? This is Tamo Okun or whatever. So again, I remind myself, it's like, okay, can we survive this if we miss this deadline? Or will it kill us to meet this deadline? And then taking that in a serious way, right? Like the stress is real, the impact is real, moving people faster than they're ready to make a decision, like that's real. There's real physical consequences to that level of stress, which again, the system tries to put us on, right? Like that's why they set the deadlines, which are arbitrary, because when they want to do something, it's amazing how fast it goes. And then when they don't want to do something, it's amazing the impediments that are put in place, right? So these are false constructs that are meant to display power about what's important. So you have to have a conversation about, can I accomplish it in another way, in another time frame, or what's the true cost of trying to meet this deadline? Do I lose connection to myself, right? Do I lose connections to the communities that I'm trying to move along because I'm trying to meet this colonial structure? And these are the decisions that have to be made. And it means, okay, you miss out on this opportunity, but this is scarcity, right? It's not like there's never going to be another opportunity. It's just not going to be that particular one. So again, this is the unpacking of the scarcity model, the unpacking of that sense of urgency that forces you to make hard decisions, but understand what's going into that decision. And I think like I said, joy is about connecting. So is this disconnecting me from myself? Is this connecting me from my communities, right? Or is this disconnecting me for a higher purpose, right? And if it's doing all those things, then that's probably not a pathway one should be taking if one is trying to get to liberatory joy. And that makes it really easy, but it makes it hard as well, right? Because you're like, but we need this. Okay, do we need it in this particular way? Because we are all survivors, so we know there's other ways to get it. Like the neglect is deep, so we know we will find other ways to get it, right?
I'll just do a quick add-on to that because, I mean, excellent. Absolutely. And it's going to continue to be a challenge. I think, what is the true cost, but also what is the true gain of making decisions in the right way is another way that I've started that conversation. I feel the pressure of deadlines. I struggle with them very much. And in the work that we do, we've had to push back a lot. And that turns into the type of policy change that I think we've experienced a lot, especially in Portland, and that shows up in trying to decolonize time and trying to decolonize some of the structures and rigor around our relationship to being able to access the land and things like that. So everything is a conversation. Like you said, these impositions are arbitrary, and we need to be able to understand everything is a conversation. Everything is about connecting with other people to understand what can we do better in order to have a much bigger ripple effect and serve the next generation, serve the next quarter, serve 7 generations down. So that's the way that we try to frame it, the way that I've been taught to try to frame it. And yeah, it's gonna be a huge challenge, and it's an internal one for those of us that are decision makers that have to also be pushing. We need to show up for people by this point, in this way, and be prepared. So it's complex in that way. I know we're short on time, but we did have a couple other questions. Speaking of.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'll try to keep it real quick. Vaughn Perry, Director of Equity and Sustainability with the Douglas Community Land Trust, formerly the Director of Equity with the 11th Street Bridge Park. You mentioned what really resonated with me was around the decolonization is not 40 acres and a mule. And it made me reflect on my work when I was working with community members. And to be frank, a lot of the community members, they weren't concerned about equity. They were concerned about their piece of the pie because of the scarcity mindset. And oftentimes I would have to engage with them in a way to try to broaden that perspective, to say, like, listen, if your neighbor's not at the table, then like none of us are free. And so I just wonder, how do you, and so the prioritizing Indigenous first is adding another layer to that. And so I'm just wondering, what are some practical ways that either of you have used to create those safe spaces to start to facilitate those conversations, specifically with community members?
I think, so I connected to liberation. Again, and I asked the question, like, are we for liberation? And again, what do we mean by liberation? Okay, if we say that we're for liberation, does participating in this system in the way in which you're thinking about it, get the bag, you know, where's my piece of the pie, moving up to the east side, all those sort of things, is like, is that bringing us liberation? And then I talk about, okay, and I think the attractiveness of that mindset is that we don't actually have a lot of people who are in those spaces, right? So like, again, and that's not me either, but there are people I know who have the penthouse this and the whatever thing, and I say to you, are you free? To what can you say no? And you realize, they are more trapped than anyone else, because they feel like they have community pressure not to lose it, right? And then they have the pressure on themselves not to lose it. But they're not happy and they're not free. So then we have, again, that conversation of like, do we want liberation, and what does liberation say like? What are the things, the thing I do now is I say, understand your positionality, because we have to understand where we come from. Then say, what are the things to which you want to be able to say no? So I want to be able to say no to working a 9 to 9, because I've never worked a 9 to 5, a 9 to 9, right? And it's a hard thing to then begin to say, I need to say no to that because my people have been enslaved for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I don't want people to use my labor that way. And that means I'm going to like value myself, so I'm going to price myself right so I can survive. And I'm going to find a way that I don't have to do the 9 to 9. What do I have to do to that? What systems do I need to engage with to be able to do that? And so I ask the question, do you want to be liberated? Not free, like I said, free for some ways, like what does that mean? But like, what do you want to say no to? Let's figure out all the things we want to say no to. Now let's build a system that allows us to say no to all of those things, right? And then you bring in, again, the exemplars of like, okay, so-and-so, someone, they're living the dream. Okay, let's have the real story. Tell us about what your experiences are. The book I'm writing now is called Super Tokens, and I'm doing interviews with all of the people in design and tech who are like the first and onlys. And the stories they tell me, like, I had to re-engage my therapist because like I'm just having to absorb all of their daily traumas they're experiencing in order to, again, have the bag and to be in those elite spaces. And I asked, like, why are you doing this? Because you've just shared 2 hours of pain with me for the next generation to make it easier, right? But again, it's a thing where, like, getting people to tell the truth of what it means to be in the places that other people aspire to so that they can see behind the curtain, so to speak, that it's just another trap. It's just another form of enslavement. Like, that's how you get them to reimagine new possibilities for themselves, right?
So, just a quick add-on to that is building relationships when needed through shared experience, and coming back to that kind of human level. I think we all need to be able to, in order to advance the work, we kind of have to be able to put the work aside and understand where we have common ground, understand where, I think one of the statements that we opened with a few days ago was we're all fighting the same fight, and kind of bringing it back to that. they can't be manufactured. It does, I think, in the ways that I've seen it come forward, happen out of true need, usually through environmental racism in the same neighborhood, right? Where what's left of indigenous neighborhoods and black neighborhoods are being coming together in order to try to take some type of action at city council. That's where that solidarity kind of starts to show up. And it's also where a lot of the movement building for something much stronger can begin. And I think in a lot of ways, we're seeing an example of that happening right now. So
I know we have to go, but I want one message for the white folks in the room. Yeah. Okay, because I think it's important, because they're like, where do I fit in all of this decolonization thing? And I say this is that the work of decolonization is the work of white folks. And it needs to be a partnership, because, okay, what we black, brown, other folks bring is that we know the ways in which the system all fails us. Which, again, the part of white privilege is that you don't experience that. So you need someone to point it out. What you have access to is actually how the system works. So when we say, oh, this is failing us here, we need someone who knows the system works. Say, so the linchpin in that system is actually this little thing there. Let's do the work to dismantle that, because that will relieve it. So again, the work of indigenization is a totally different thing, and I don't go there, but the work of decolonization, like, that's the work of white folks, but you need other folks to tell you where the system is failing them so that we can do the work together to dismantle it. So I just want that message to be clear, because like I said, if you don't have access to the system, you're mystified as to why it's failing you. And that, again, reflects the fact that the system, you don't have access to it, you don't know what it looks like. But if you're living in that system, you know exactly how it works. So your knowledge is necessary to dismantle it, because that's the gap, right? It has to work together. So I just want y'all to be clear about, y'all got a role to play in this, right?
thank you, Dori. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand it back to you guys here before we break.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We have a 15-minute break and then off to our next sessions. And we will put up the QR code if anyone would like to do their survey early.